scare tactics are widely used by many extremist organizations in order to advance their unprecedented agendas. Al-Qaeda successfully dropped the World Trade Towers to keep Americans living in fear. Politicians use tragedies like Sandy Hook to invoke fear and rob good people of their liberties.
Why shotgun? Why shotgun?
And so-called environmental activists spread propaganda to make people fear the food they eat. The foods they claim could potentially kill you and the environment are genetically modified organisms, also known as GMOs.
I think GMOs are dangerous and irresponsible.
They should be mandatory labeling.
I guess I would just rather have my food natural, grows from the earth, and not modified.
It's a requirement. GMOs are horrifying, though.
Should we really be scared of vegetables? Are GMOs as bad as the activists make them out to be?
The anti-GM crop people are building their arguments mostly on scare tactics and not so much on science.
I'm not anti-science. I'm anti-lack of science when it comes to GMOs.
There has actually been a ton of research conducted on GMOs in the past few decades, although some people like to ignore this research and push on with their own false propaganda.
We have a model in organic where it took 13 years to draft regulations for organic and an industry to say, please regulate us, please federal government, inspect our fields, inspect our manufacturing, and make it really difficult to get an organic seal. So that's 13 years from idea to federal law in 2002. Within a year, GMOs were out and in production, and they aren't required to be inspected. There is absolutely a dearth of research.
It's exactly the same process as any prescription drug that comes on the market. And the questions that are asked of those companies are the same questions that is asked of the Monsantos and the Syngentas to introduce a biotech gene. And the cost is getting just astronomical anymore too to get something in the pipeline. And you know, people whine about that only the Syngentas and Monsantos are doing this. Well, there's a reason. They're the only ones with pockets deep enough to go through the process this day and age because of the regulatory and the difficulties getting it through the FDA. And it used to be a 2 or 3 year process, and now it's 10 or 12.
In 2011, 160 million hectares of biotech crops were grown, which is 10% of the Earth's arable land. This is also an 8% increase from the previous year.
You can't drive through Iowa anymore and really very easily find any organic corn. That you are in a sea of GMO corn if you're in harvest in August. That is past the tipping point and shameful.
I would say within the next 3 years, the number of GM crops that will be planted worldwide will increase by 30-40%. So that's a huge number, and the number is going to increase dramatically.
Biotech crops allow farmers to raise crops and livestock more efficiently than organic farming techniques. They are able to get higher yields on less land, which is important with an ever-increasing world population.
By between now and 2050, it's predicted that the population of the world will increase by maybe 40%.
You know, China and India and that part of the world is the population's going to explode over there. The life expectancy is longer than it used to be. And, you know, you can't hardly say, well, that's not a good thing, but, I mean, to those people it probably is, and they want to eat.
GM crops will tend to give you a higher yield with less variation from year to year, which is going to be important if we want to feed a population of 10 billion or more.
I don't think there's any other choice. You can read whatever you want about how yields of organic crops have kept up with other yields, but realistically, it's not there.
Organic farming is sustainable to some extent, but it's only sustainable if it's okay to produce less. Organic farming does produce between 3 and 55% less crop per acre.
Ironically, the anti-GMO activists are doing everything in their power to derail scientific progress, and while doing so, they are actually killing nature in a big way.
Bum 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 bum. Monsanto, quit being so mean.
Bum 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 bum.
You're scaring farmers from building their dream.
Bum 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 bum.
You drench our soils with your poisonous stream. Then tell us that organic foods are over.
One of the big arguments for genetic modification, in my view, as far as the environmental issues are, as the human population increases, we either grow more food on less land or we increase the amount of land that we cultivate. Well, we already cultivate a lot of land. The more land we cultivate, the less biological diversity we have. So in my view, the less wild land that has to go under cultivation, the better. So if we can grow more food on the land that we already have, then that's a step in the right direction.
And so if you want to convert to organic farming, you need more farmland available. And we don't have more cropland available. To do so, we would have to cut down forests.
Some organic farmers argue that their farms actually double as habitats for wildlife.
This is so not about farm. We are actually growing a habitat, and we're stewards of this little 35-acre plot of land. We're in charge of being stewards of that, but not just for family. It's for all these living things that kind of get to call this little place home.
Increased yields is one major benefit of growing GM crops, but there are many other beneficial factors.
The potential benefits of GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, are that you may be able to engineer a crop that can tolerate really dry conditions, for example. So if you're talking about a marginal agricultural area in Africa, for example, where drought is a really big problem, then engineering a plant that is more drought tolerant or drought resistant can allow that crop to be grown in an area where it normally couldn't be grown.
The development of GM crops is rapidly progressing. The crops that are currently being planted by farmers are mostly first-generation GM crops.
We farm today about 1,500 acres, and it's all irrigated. Our main crops are sugar beets. We do a lot of corn, and we do a lot of malt barley for Miller Coors Company.
There has been some problems with first-generation GM crops, but scientists hope to weed out those issues in later generations.
So my reason for being very suspicious of GMOs isn't that I'm flat out they are bad. There's a lot of research showing that they do produce super weeds, and I think that's wrong.
The fear or the concern, and it's a valid ecological concern, is that genetically modified crops, for example, might exchange genes, might reproduce or breed with plants that are already weedy. So a great example is canola in Canada, and in the northern Midwest. So it's in the genus Brassica, and there are weeds that are also in that same genus. So they're very closely related. They're close cousins, essentially. So if you genetically modify the canola to be resistant to an herbicide, and those genes drift into a population of weeds, then you've just conferred that herbicide resistance to the weeds. That's probably the clearest example where the transfer of genes from a genetically modified crop into a weed has been the most clearly demonstrated.
I mean, there's issues today, and I'm sure you realize that there's some areas in the country that are having weed-resistant issues, and we had such issues with sugar beets, with weeds, that we knew if we ever got Roundup Ready beets, we didn't want that to be a problem here. Today we have zero weed resistance in this area. When Roundup Ready sugar beets come out, I mean, it was a huge, huge improvement for us. But some of the keys and some of the mistakes that have been made is not using other chemistry to counteract that. Just go out and spray everything with Roundup, and that's not good good stewardship as far as I'm concerned, and I think that's been some of the issues back in the Midwest where they do have some weed-resistant issues.
A lot of these weeds that the Roundup Ready has been designed to naturally kill, nature kind of rules and comes in, and over the course of years, these weeds build up a resistance, much like germs in our body can build up a resistance to certain antibiotics.
But the nuance is that if you have a crop that's herbicide resistant, so like Roundup Ready crops are herbicide resistant, the genes get transferred into those native plants, but then you don't spray Roundup in areas where they occur, then that native plant has no advantage, right? Because you're not putting it in the context where it would have an advantage. It only has an advantage when you're spraying Roundup on it. So people get concerned about these superweeds forming. It really depends on how they're being managed. If you don't ever spray Roundup, it doesn't really benefit the plant to have a Roundup resistant gene. So they may do no better than any other plant, and they wouldn't necessarily turn into super weeds. So genes do drift from genetically modified crops into native plants and weedy plants. That's been clearly demonstrated. But the next step is to demonstrate that that actually causes a problem.
First-generation GM crops are engineered to resist herbicide and insects. Second and third generation GM crops will be engineered to tolerate harsh environments, resist disease, and have higher nutritional qualities. When the drought season hits West Africa, the crops wither away and kids die due to malnourishment because there is nothing to eat. Imagine if farmers would grow drought-tolerant crops, so when the drought hits, their crops will survive and they will have something to eat. Natural selection has not yet made this variety, so if it takes genetic engineering to do so, shouldn't we make it happen? Or should we tell the mothers in West Africa, I'm sorry, but your child is going to have to die because we think it's a bad idea to use this solution?
There's people in this area that feel that there must be a lot better than people in China, that they can go ahead and buy their organic food and live very well, and yet have people have lack stuff to eat in other parts of the world.
We're sitting here in Boulder, Colorado. There's a lot of people who socioeconomically are super spoiled and privileged and have done very well. It's probably easy to get a little Portlandia about, oh, we have this organic farm and it's aesthetic and it's beautiful. I just want to be really honest, the economics of it, almost every year we look at, have we broken even, or have we lost just a little or made just a little?
Anti-GMO activists argue that there is not a lack of food in the world, even though at least 1 million children die every year due to starvation.
I don't think we have a lack of calories situation globally. All studies will show it's distribution, and it's poor distribution channels. It's not yield.
That has nothing to do with whether it's genetically modified or not, but whether the food that's produced actually gets to the consumer that's going to eat it.
Obviously, the United States has plenty of food to go around, and most of the citizens are eating way too much of it. But the federal government is broke, and the U.S. can't afford to ship food to every starving nation in the world. Even if we did, militias would likely take control of the goods, and the people it was intended for would probably never see it or get killed when the shipments get hijacked. Shipping goods also uses a lot of fuel, which is considered bad for the environment, and also much of the food will spoil before it even reaches its final destination. That is why the people around the world need the ability to produce food for themselves. They can't always rely on other nations to come to their aid. America was founded on the principles that people take responsibility for their own lives. So why should we expect other countries to rely on us to keep them from starving? You would probably feel pretty vulnerable if you had to wait for a plane to fly by to drop your next meal. In addition to crops being withered away by drought, they can also be wiped out by viral and bacterial diseases. GM crops have been developed to stop these diseases from spreading.
The papaya industry in Hawaii was nearly wiped out in the 40s and 50s due to a virus. And then Hawaiian scientists introduced a viral protein that, when it's being expressed, prevents the virus then from replicating.
When a virus replicates, it can effectively wipe out an entire plantation and beyond. In Hawaii, the GM crops saved the entire papaya industry.
And so overall, the number of virus-infected plants will also go down dramatically if you've got plants that are vaccinated. And that is going to be one of the major new advances in the field of GM crops, is being able to vaccinate plants against viral diseases. And again, you don't have to spray anymore. You can just, once a plant is vaccinated, it's protected.
Until scientists figure out how to vaccinate sugar beets, Paul will use his own method to reduce the chances of losing his crops to disease.
Sugar beets needs to be at least a 3-year rotation for other disease reasons that, I mean, they're susceptible to lots of different issues. We try to stay on a 5-year rotation, so we'll plant a field of sugar beets, have a corn crop, a barley crop, a corn crop, before it goes back to sugar beets, if not another one yet on top of that. So, and then we do rotate alfalfa in and out of there too also.
Organic farmers actually benefit from having their crops planted adjacent to GM crops.
They found that 50% of the benefits of planting GM crops in the Midwest were obtained by the non-GM crop farmers. Because if you reduce the amount of corn borers, you actually dramatically decrease the number of corn borers that will attack organic corn fields.
Sylvia might actually be able to benefit from having GM crops grown around her farmland.
There is a Mexican flea beetle that has attacked our Romano bean crop for 4 seasons. We finally had to just till under that crop and not grow that crop for 2 years. And we were lucky. We had an extension agent from CSU who is specializing in organic, and he came and walked the fields each summer, and he finally said, that pest is really persistent, and you just need to till it under and wait 2 seasons. So sometimes we have to give it up. You know, Mother Nature gets to rule. We don't get to grow everything we want to, but we still want to keep that soil healthy.
GM crops that reduce the number of corn borers help the neighboring organic farmers. But this has a second major benefit for consumers, because when a corn borer goes into a plant, it produces a hole. This is where fungi can also enter the plants.
There's a certain fungus that, under certain humid conditions in corn growing areas, will then enter into the plants, and in its fight to control the plant's defense responses, it will produce a toxic chemical known as fumonisine.
Studies have shown that fumonisins will affect human cells in different ways. They can produce cancer as well as other health dangers. Fumonisins, when ingested by women during early stages of pregnancy, will result in spina bifida babies.
Where the spinal cord region doesn't close. And outbreaks of spina bifida amongst newborn children have been correlated in the United States, in Guatemala, and in South Africa with increased amounts of corn borer action and fungal growth in those affected corn plants.
European studies have shown that organic corn products contain between 100 and 1,000 times the amount of fumonisins as GM corn. So GM corn is actually the safest corn to eat right now. So in addition to creating plants that are more drought and disease resistant, what else are scientists working on?
Getting plants to produce more nutritious foods. And the most famous example is the golden rice.
There's a big literature on that, of trying to enhance the nutritional quality, especially of certain crops like rice they're essentially not very nutrient rich at all. And because a vast majority of people in the world eat that, is there a way to increase the nutritional quality so that human health can be improved in those areas?
In Asia, millions of people grow up, very poor people, who get most of their nutrition from rice, and they can't afford other foods. Rice is a good source for carbohydrates. It contains a little bit of protein, but that diet lacks certain vitamins. And one of the vitamins that is very crucial is vitamin A.
Scientists from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology and the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines have succeeded in transferring genes into rice to increase the quantities of vitamin A and other micronutrients. This innovation could have a huge impact for millions of people with vitamin A deficiencies, which is largely responsible for blindness in developing nations.
The rice contains enough of these precursor molecules to completely alleviate the deficiency in vitamin A of people whose main diet is this golden rice. They also are working on, I gather, with supplementing the rice with some iron. And these supplements will, for instance, prevent 500,000 cases of blindness in children every year. And the iron will be very important for women who require more iron to replace the blood that they lose on a monthly basis.
A lot of people in developing nations eat a few bowls of rice per day and little else. More than 3 billion people in the world depend on rice as their main staple, and 10% have a vitamin A deficiency, which aside from blindness, can even lead to death.
I think it's important to explore the topic very broadly, rather than focus explicitly on whether Monsanto is good or bad, but think more broadly about how can we continue to produce crops in an environmentally friendly way, and does genetic modification help us get there, and in a humane way, and providing food for people who don't currently have enough food.
It's time for developed countries to make good on their promises to the poor, and for developing nations to embrace new technology, including genetically modified crops. Unfortunately, many of the poorest countries who are strongly affected by famine have set up strict regulations that prevent the growth and import of GM food and crops. This is a problem that the environmental activists are mostly responsible for creating.
GMOs, I'd just love to see more science that's not funded by Dow or Monsanto. I'd love to see third-party science that shows the risks and benefits. The ratio makes me more comfortable.
The misperception, I think, that genetic modification is bad because it's associated with big corporations like Monsanto. And that's true. I mean, Monsanto has done a lot of things that are unconscionable. On the other hand, genetic modification doesn't have to be done by a company like Monsanto. Genetic modification can be done, and is done, in university laboratories and given free of charge to people in developing countries that need that technology. So we can move toward a more open access model of sharing the technology that's beneficial to society with no corporate greed involved at all. So I think when people hear genetic modification or genetic engineering or GMO, they often immediately associate it with Monsanto, and that doesn't have to be the case. There are lots of the tool itself, genetic modification, is completely independent of corporate corruption and greed.
I think we've just touched the tip of the iceberg and seeing what comes out from biotechnology in the future. I think healthier foods, and we need to grow more food on less acres, and there's not very many ways to do that, and I think biotech can help.
When we talk about improving farming, improving food supplies, food quality, let's use the best available technologies for doing so. What is important is what you transfer, and are the plants that you produce in this transfer, are they producing something useful and safe? And we should not classify plants based on how that you transfer the DNA. That's such an artificial thing. And so I feel very comfortable eating any kind of GM crop.